That afternoon passed so smoothly that no one remembered it. There was no gloomy sky, no unsettling feeling, no warning signs of anything to come. Just a very ordinary summer afternoon, the kind of ordinariness that makes people believe they are safe. Joe Wills stepped out of the house with the keys in hand, thinking about the short trip ahead. A trip without pressure, without fear. Just a few days away from familiar life. A few days to breathe, to laugh and talk. And then he would return. He didn't look back at the house one last time. No one does that when they're sure they'll be back soon. Marbell Knox closed her phone after sending a text message to her mother. A simple message, basically saying she'd be home on Sunday. She didn't write any longer, as there was no reason to elaborate. For Marbell, everything was under control. She was always prepared, always cautious, and because of that, she didn't think about the risks. The blue car parked silently in front of the house. An ordinary car, unremarkable, not attracting anyone's attention. When the engine started, no one stood to see them off. No lingering hug. No parting words. Just two people leaving, carrying with them the very human belief that the road ahead would lead them back. On afternoons like these, the greatest danger isn't the darkness, but the feeling of security. Because when everything becomes too familiar, too peaceful, people don't realize that in just a very small, very quiet moment, everything can take a turn from which there's no return. Joe Wills wasn't the type to cause anyone worry. He was 22, an age when many are still impulsive, but Joe was different. His life followed simple, straightforward lines. Going to work on time, coming home on schedule, weekends spent with family, and a few close friends. No secrets, no hidden corners. In his family's eyes, Joe was the son they rarely had to ask about, not because they were indifferent, but because they trusted him. He always called when needed. He always answered the phone, even when he was tired. He never kept anyone waiting in worry. Joe's presence was like a good habit, quiet but reliable. Friends say Joe isn't a talkative person. He listens more, thinks before he acts. When there's a problem, people turn to Joe because they know he won't abandon them. He's the kind of person who, if he says he'll do it, he'll definitely do it. No need for big promises. Joe had no reason to disappear. He had no debts, no conflicts. He wasn't running away from anything. His future was unfolding in a very normal way. A stable job, small plans for the coming year, familiar evenings at the family dinner table. Therefore, when Joe left that afternoon, no one felt the need to stop him. No one considered the worst-case scenario. Because for someone like Joe Wills, disappearance was not something he could control. And that, later, became the greatest haunting memory for those who remained. Marbell Knox is the type of person who always thinks one step ahead before doing anything. At 21, she lacks the impulsiveness often seen in youth. Marbell lives slowly, observes carefully, and firmly believes that caution isn't a sign of weakness, but rather a way to protect what she cherishes. She memorized her schedule. She texted to let them know. She paid attention to the little details that others often overlooked. For Marbell, her family's peace of mind was just as important as her own freedom. Therefore, every time she went somewhere, she always left a very human trace. A message, a promise, a date of return. Those close to her say that Marbell isn't a thrill seeker. She dislikes impulsive decisions and doesn't venture into places where she feels uncertain. If a path seems too uncertain, Marbell will stop. Not out of fear, but because she understands her limits. She had no reason to take risks. No running away, no resistance to life, no despair to leave behind. Marbell's life was in a very normal phase, learning to grow, learning to love, learning to stand firm. Therefore, Marbell Knox's disappearance renders all theories meaningless. A cautious person wouldn't deliberately put themselves in danger. A person who always leaves a trace couldn't simply vanish without a word. And when Marbell didn't return, what hurt the family most wasn't the loss, But the unanswered question, what could have swept away such a careful person in absolute silence? The decision to leave was very simple. No lengthy discussions, no elaborate preparations, just a fleeting thought that a few days away from familiar routines might be good for both of us. A short trip, no fixed destination, no pressure to be on time or in the right place. Joe thought about the path ahead. Marbell thought about taking a break from their usual routines. They naturally agreed that they would travel, stop wherever they pleased, and return on Sunday evening. No reservations needed, no step-by-step notes required. Everything was left to the comfort they had always believed in. They brought very ordinary things with them. A little cash, a few personal items, some snacks for the long journey. No one prepared for the worst. No one thought about protecting themselves. Because in their minds, this wasn't a dangerous trip. It was just a break. It is this comfort that removes invisible layers of defense. When people believe they are in a safe zone, they don't ask questions. They don't check the map. They don't worry about less traveled routes. Subjectivity doesn't manifest as recklessness, but as trust. And in many of these stories, tragedy doesn't begin with one big wrong decision. It begins with a very small, very ordinary choice. An unplanned trip. A belief that if you just follow the path ahead, everything will be all right. Sunday evening arrived, quite ordinarily. Dinner was served. The television was set to a low volume in the living room. The clock ticked past its usual intervals without anyone noticing. Initially, the silence didn't alarm anyone. In that year, intermittent phone signals were commonplace. A little lateness wasn't a big deal. Marbell's mother called. The phone rang and then went dead. Voicemail played. She waited, telling herself her daughter was either driving or somewhere without a signal. An hour later, she called again. The result was the same. Not fear, but a strange, very light feeling, like a grain of sand in a shoe. Joe's family was waiting too. They considered the possibility that he might be stopping somewhere later than expected. Joe usually let them know when he was running late, but perhaps this time was different. They trusted his habits, believing that everything would work out on its own. But as night deepened, the silence was no longer a harmless void. It began to carry weight. The phone lay motionless on the table. No vibration, no light, not a single signal to latch onto. The initial comforting assumptions were slowly losing their effectiveness. There are moments when people can't yet name their fear, but their bodies sense it. Heartbeats quicken. Eyes glance at the clock more often. The wait lasts longer than usual. Sunday night passed in that state of limbo, where no one dared think of the worst, but no one truly felt at ease either. The silence began to whisper something, very softly, but enough to prevent those who remained from sleeping soundly. Monday morning held no drama. It arrived like any other morning, with its soft sunlight and familiar routines. But it was precisely this ordinariness that made the unease more apparent than ever. Joe didn't show up for work. Not a call asking for permission, not a message saying he'd be late. To those who knew him, this was unprecedented. Colleagues started asking each other, "Has anyone heard anything? Has anyone been able to get in touch?" The questions repeated, but there were no answers. At the same time, Marbell didn't show up where she'd promised to be. No excuses, no request to switch shifts. A meticulous person like Marbell would never disappear from her schedule. When she didn't show up, the family's anxiety immediately turned into tangible fear. The phones remained silent. Calls followed one after another, but only cold voicemails were received. No one could reassure themselves that they were just running late. No one dared say it out loud, but everyone understood. This was no longer just a delay. The morning dragged on heavily. The family began sifting through every conversation, every last word, searching for a sign they had previously overlooked. But there was nothing. No warning, no premonition, no unusual moment to cling to. By this point, the disappearance was no longer a hypothesis. It had become a cold reality. Two trustworthy, cautious, stable individuals had not returned. And when that was confirmed in broad daylight, the fear was no longer vague. It stood there, clear, undeniable, opening up a question no one was prepared to confront. Where had they disappeared to? And when had things begun to deviate from their familiar course? When the family entered the police station that morning, no one expected an immediate answer. They simply wanted to be heard, to have their concerns confirmed. But in those familiar offices, everything proceeded in a very normal, very administrative manner. The questions were asked in a calm tone. How long had they known each other? Were there any emotional conflicts? Were there financial problems, personal pressures, or any other reasons for leaving? The family answered each question slowly and confidently. No, no, and no. Joe was steady. Marbell was cautious. They had a plan to return. Neither of them had ever done anything impulsive or out of control. In the early hours, the hypothesis wasn't that danger was imminent. Police considered a delay, a wrong turn, a dead phone battery, a decision to stay longer without prior notice. Those possibilities sounded plausible, since most cases of lost contact end that way. But as the records were opened, the small details began to become unsettling. No calls had been made after Saturday night. No card transactions. No indication of the trip continuing. The silence didn't seem like a choice. It felt like an abrupt halt. The police maintained a neutral tone. They advised the family to wait longer. But in the eyes of those sitting opposite, anxiety had overtaken patience. Because in some cases, the instincts of loved ones precede all procedures. And that morning, though no one had spoken it aloud, a shared feeling began to form. This was no longer a normal delay. This was an unusual gap, and it was growing with each passing hour. When all other lines of thought began to fail, the police officer's gaze focused on one thing: Joe's blue car, the most important piece of evidence, and also the most silent one in the entire story. It wasn't a standout car, no distinctive features, no easily recognizable signs among thousands of other vehicles on the road. It was precisely this ordinariness that made it invisible. A car that could pass by without anyone noticing, without anyone glancing back. The license plate was entered into the system. Patrol stations were notified. Major roads, side streets, and neighboring states were all searched, but the car didn't appear. No traffic cameras captured its image. No toll booth identified it. No gas station attendant remembered seeing the two young people stop. With each passing day, the silence of the car grew heavier. Accidents usually leave traces: a skid mark, a bent fence, a distress call. But here, there was nothing. It was as if the car had lifted off the ground, vanished from the familiar flow of traffic. For the family, the car became a specific obsession. They imagined it everywhere under a forest canopy, by the riverbank, in some deserted field. Every time the phone rang, they hoped to hear the familiar words, "We found the car." But that statement never came. The green car, which should have been the most honest witness, remained completely silent. And that silence made all the theories even more terrifying. Because when an object that shouldn't disappear still disappears, it means the answer lies somewhere no one would expect. The first few days of the search passed in a state of both urgency and caution. The police followed familiar routes that Joe and Marble might have chosen. Main roads first, then side streets, deserted stretches of road where people usually stopped to rest. Every eye was on edge, searching for the slightest sign. They looked down at the curb, into the ditches, at the patches of grass run over by vehicles. They searched for broken glass, oil slicks, unusual tire marks, but the road surface was intact. The grass wasn't disturbed. There was nothing to suggest a car had been involved in an accident. The cold, immaculate perfection of the scene was perplexing. Witnesses were questioned. People living along the road were knocked on the door. Did anyone hear a collision? Did anyone see a car stop unusually? The answers were all the same: no. I don't remember. I didn't see anything. The road had swallowed up any sound, if any ever existed. The search team expanded its scope. They checked stretches of road running alongside the river, blind bends in the road, and open spaces where the accident might have been hidden. But even in the most dangerous areas, there was no sign. No broken fences, no fallen trees, no dropped objects. For the family, each day of searching was a day of dwindling hope. They clung to every phone call, every brief report, only to be plunged into emptiness again. No broken pieces to grieve over. No witnesses to accuse. Just a prolonged void, allowing fear to grow slowly, cruelly. Because when there is nothing to cling to, people begin to understand that the truth may lie beyond all familiar assumptions. When days of searching yielded no new findings, the case file gradually changed status. Not closed, just set aside. From urgent to pending, from action to monitoring. People call it a cold file, but for the family, the pain never cools. Time began to flow differently. Week after week, month after month. Each time the phone rang, their hearts would tighten, then sink when the news on the other end wasn't what they expected. The familiar questions were no longer repeated. Only a prolonged silence remained, like a windowless room. Joe and Marbell's family lives in a state of limbo. They can't fully grieve, because there's no conclusion yet. They can't fully hope because each passing day takes away a piece of their faith. They stand between two shores, afraid to cross either. Crossing into grief means accepting loss, while crossing into hope means exhausting themselves. Meals lack familiar seating arrangements. Conversations are interrupted when someone inadvertently mentions a name. Rooms remain unchanged, as if the owner were only temporarily absent. Time doesn't heal. It only prolongs the feeling of waiting until people are weary of the waiting itself. In the files, the pages lie dormant. In the real world, each passing day is a day the family must learn to live with an unanswered question. And in that state of limbo, the cruelest thing is not the loss, but not knowing what they are waiting for. Waiting for a miracle, or waiting for a truth painful enough to finally bring an end to it all. 11 years didn't pass by in days and months. They passed by in unfulfilled waits, in changing seasons, in holidays that felt emptier than the year before. Time doesn't make things disappear. It only makes them settle, deeper, heavier. Joe and Marbell's family had maintained old habits for a long time. They still left their phones on ringer. They still answered unknown numbers. They still believed that if there was news, it would come when they least expected it. But over the years, that expectation changed shape. It was no longer sharp. It became weary. The questions are no longer spoken aloud. They remain there, in the silences between conversations, in the averted glances when someone inadvertently mentions their name. On some evenings, hope comes gently, then departs just as quickly, leaving behind a familiar feeling of emptiness. 11 years is long enough for people to learn to move on, long enough for the world around them to move forward. New jobs, new families, children growing up. But for those left behind, time is stuck at a single point, a point Joe and Marbell never returned to. Hope doesn't disappear suddenly. It erodes gradually, like a stone being worn down by water day after day. It doesn't hurt immediately, but eventually, it changes shape. By the time people realize it, hope is no longer a strong belief, but just a very faint thought that perhaps, if the truth were to appear, they would be ready to face it. Not because they want to, but because they no longer have the strength to wait. There were no emergency calls, no sirens. The truth emerged in the quietest way possible. 11 years after Joe and Marbell disappeared, an old plot of land was being cleared in preparation for renovation. It had once been an abandoned quarry, filled in by time and rainwater, becoming a quiet, unnoticed lake. Trees grew around its banks. The old entrance was almost forgotten. The excavator worked steadily and slowly, each lifting and lowering motion was like any other workday, until the bucket hit a hard object deep beneath the mud. At first, the operator thought it was just scrap metal or old equipment left over from the mining era. When the mud was pulled up, the shape that emerged didn't elicit a gasp. It just made people stop. A car roof, a window frame, a familiar object, yet one no one wanted to recognize immediately. Work was interrupted. No one spoke loudly. No one rushed forward. The police were called. The area was sealed off in silence. There were no crowds, no television cameras, only the still water, reflecting the sky, as if it had concealed this secret for years, without wavering. Once the license plate was clean enough to read, no one needed to guess anymore. Joe's name returned to the records, not as a missing person, but as a delayed answer. After 11 years, where they had stopped was no longer a hypothesis. It lay there, so close, so quiet, found not because someone had given up, but because the land and water had finally spoken. The car was slowly lifted out of the water, as if no one wanted to further disturb a story that had lain dormant for too long. Thick mud clung to the body. The metal was rusted. The glass was cloudy. But beneath all the marks of time, the structure remained, enough to tell the story of what had happened. The technicians worked in silence. They searched for signs of a violent collision, of panic, of a moment of loss of control. But the car showed no such damage, no severe dents to the front end, no twisted chassis, no signs of a high-speed crash. Inside, everything remained almost perfectly still. The two front seats were still in place. There were no signs of a struggle. No belongings had been disturbed. Nothing indicated the presence of a third person. The silence in the car wasn't the silence of fear, but the silence of a moment when one hadn't yet grasped what was happening. The remaining data was carefully checked. No alcohol, no stimulants, no factors that could impair judgment. Joe had been driving in a completely normal state. Marbell sat beside him, showing no signs of tension. No one had been prepared for a dangerous situation. When the initial reports were finalized, one thing became clear. This wasn't a reckless act, not a panic, not a series of major mistakes. It was a very brief, very quiet moment, when people hadn't yet realized that the ground ahead was no longer a familiar path. And when they did, there was no chance of reversing it. When the car offered no further clues, the investigation shifted to the smallest pieces, things that seemed insignificant, yet had the power to hold the key to success. A flimsy paper receipt, a blurry photograph, an overlooked road. The receipt was found under the driver's seat, damp, faded, but still legible. A small convenience store, a late Saturday evening. Not sensational evidence, just a very human stop. Buy a few odds and ends, rest for a few minutes, then continue on. A moment so ordinary that no one would have thought it would be the final milestone. From that receipt, the store's old security camera footage was reviewed. The images were blurry, the lighting weak, but enough to make out the blue car rolling into the parking lot. 2 people were inside. No rush, no tension, no one following them. They left in a very familiar way, like hundreds of other cars that night. The crucial point was the turn. The car didn't continue straight down the main road. It turned onto a smaller, narrower, less lit lane. A dark, gravel road, with no clear signage. It looked like a U-turn, or a side road leading to an old service area. In the night, the line between a safe road and a dead end was very thin. When the police stood there in broad daylight, everything became painfully clear. The road led straight to the abandoned quarry. No barriers, no warnings, nothing indicating that deep water lay ahead. To someone unfamiliar with the terrain, it was simply a natural continuation of the road. The final piece of the puzzle fits in. No chase, no violence, no conspiracy, just a brief stop, a wrong turn in the darkness, and a path that led them away from the familiar map. As the crucial data emerges, the story doesn't become more dramatic. It becomes heavier, Because the truth is sometimes so simple that no one wants to accept it. When all the data is pieced together, the final picture gradually emerges, not through drama, but through the cold logic of minute details. Accident experts stand before the gravel road leading to the quarry and begin to reconstruct that moment, meter by meter, angle by angle. In the darkness of the night, the road didn't look dangerous at all. No steep slopes, no sudden bends, just a narrow, elongated path. Like many other service roads, the wheels rolled slowly. There was no sign of acceleration, no sudden braking. The car moved forward, confident that the ground ahead remained solid. The mistake wasn't in reckless action. It was in misunderstanding. The boundary between the road and the water in the darkness almost disappears. When the front wheel touches the gap, there's no time for human reaction. Everything happens in a few brief seconds, fast enough that no one understands what's happening. The car slid silently down the water. No loud crash, no flashing lights, just a slow, steady motion, as if the ground simply vanished. Once the water flooded the cabin, there was virtually no time to react. The doors were heavy. The water pressure rose rapidly. Panic, if any, didn't have time to form. Experts concluded that this was a series of very small mistakes, but irreparable ones. There was no second chance to turn back, no opportunity to stop and think. Just one ordinary decision made in the dark, and the consequences are permanent. What makes this story so heartbreaking is not its complexity, but its simplicity. An accident doesn't need a perpetrator, just an unguarded road and a moment when a person believes they are still going in the right direction. The call came without a lengthy opening. The voice on the other end was low, slow, and more cautious than usual. Just a few brief sentences, but enough to silence the room. The family had waited 11 years for a call like this, and when it came, no one was really prepared. There were no screams, no collapse as one might expect, only prolonged silences as each person tried to comprehend what they had just heard. The truth didn't come like a blow. It seeped in, slowly, heavily, as if years of waiting had returned in a single moment. Marbelle's mother sat silently in her chair, her hands on her lap, her gaze fixed on nothing in particular. She had lived too long in a state of fragile hope. When that hope was replaced by certainty, emotions had nowhere to hide. The pain finally took shape, and that very fact made it even harder to breathe. Joe's family listened in silence. They didn't ask many questions. The questions had been asked for the past 11 years. Now, the only thing left was to accept. Joe hadn't disappeared. He had been there all this time, just a great distance away from them, unnoticed by anyone. The truth came too late to salvage anything. But it was clear enough to end the uncertainty. No more waiting for the phone to ring unconsciously. No more keeping the rooms as if loved ones could return at any moment. Painful, but a complete pain. In those houses, the tears didn't fall profusely. They fell drop by drop, slowly, deeply, and silently. Because after 11 years, what the family needed was not just answers, but the right to begin the grieving process that they had been deprived of for so long. When all the pieces fit together, the story doesn't lead to a trial. There are no handcuffed culprits. There's no specific evil to name. The truth emerges in a colder way, because it doesn't take the form of a human being. Joe and Marbelle didn't die because of cruelty. They died because of a system that had been silent for too long. An unmarked road, an abandoned quarry without barriers, a dangerous area left unattended as if no one ever passed through it again. These details, taken individually, are harmless, but when combined, they form an invisible trap. No one woke up that morning intending to harm anyone. No one made a malicious decision. But irresponsibility, when prolonged, can be just as dangerous as a deliberate act, because it allows risks to exist, waiting to encounter an ordinary person in an ordinary moment. What makes this story painful isn't its complexity. It's painful because it could happen to anyone. A turn in the dark, a belief that the road ahead was safe, and a system that failed to speak up in time to warn. Joe and Marble didn't leave a grand lesson with loud pronouncements. They left behind a quiet question. How many more dangers lurk in silence, simply because we've become accustomed to ignoring them? And if no one takes responsibility, that silence will continue. Not noisy, not violent, but enough to steal lives that shouldn't be lost.